The Phantom Menace: How Myths and Media Turned Muslims into Britain's Bogeyman. The perception of Muslims as a threat in the UK is a deeply rooted issue that has developed over time due to a confluence of historical, political, social, and media-related factors. These elements have contributed to a pervasive sense of fear and suspicion toward the Muslim community, which is often shaped by prejudices and biases. To understand why these perceptions exist and persist, it is essential to delve into the underlying causes, the ways in which these views are reinforced, and the impact they have on both the Muslim community and broader British society. One of the key factors contributing to the perception of Muslims as a threat is the historical relationship between the UK and the Muslim world. The British Empire, at its height, included vast territories in regions where Islam was the dominant religion, such as South Asia and the Middle East. The colonial experience was marked by exploitation, violence, and cultural imposition, which fostered resentment and mistrust between the colonizers and the colonized. This legacy has endured, with some British people inheriting a sense of superiority or suspicion toward Muslims, viewing them through a lens colored by the colonial past. The post-World War II period saw significant immigration to the UK from former colonies, including large numbers of Muslims from countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. These immigrants were often invited to fill labor shortages in the rebuilding of the British economy, but their arrival also led to tensions as communities struggled to adapt to the new cultural landscape. The influx of immigrants challenged the traditional notions of British identity, which had been largely homogeneous and Christian. The presence of visible and practicing Muslims, with different cultural practices and religious beliefs, was sometimes met with hostility and fear. This fear was not always based on direct interactions, but rather on preconceived notions and stereotypes about Muslims, often rooted in the colonial mindset. The perception of Muslims as a security threat became particularly pronounced after the September 11th attacks in the United States and the July 7th bombings in London. These events, which were carried out by individuals identifying as Muslims, reinforced fears that the Muslim community as a whole was sympathetic to or complicit in terrorism. The actions of a few extremists were often unfairly extrapolated to the entire Muslim population, leading to collective blame and suspicion. The media played a significant role in amplifying these fears by focusing extensively on the Muslim identity of the perpetrators, often at the expense of providing context or exploring the broader socio-political factors that contribute to radicalization. The rise of Islamist extremism, both globally and within the UK, further entrenched the perception of Muslims as a threat. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which promoted a radical interpretation of Islam, carried out horrific acts of violence that were widely publicized. Some British Muslims were drawn to these groups, either as foreign fighters or as sympathizers, which fed into the narrative that Muslims were inherently dangerous or disloyal to the UK. The government's response to this threat often involved counter-terrorism measures that disproportionately targeted Muslim communities, leading to feelings of alienation and persecution among Muslims. These measures, while intended to protect national security, sometimes had the unintended consequence of reinforcing the very perceptions they sought to combat. Media representation has been a powerful driver of Islamophobia in the UK. The media often sensationalizes stories involving Muslims, particularly when they relate to terrorism, crime, or cultural differences. This selective coverage creates a skewed image of the Muslim community, where negative stories are disproportionately highlighted while positive contributions are overlooked. For example, the media frequently reports on isolated incidents of crime or radicalization within the Muslim community, but rarely covers the everyday lives of ordinary Muslims who contribute positively to British society. This imbalance in reporting fosters a sense of fear and mistrust among the broader public, who may not have direct interactions with Muslims and rely on the media to shape their perceptions. Political manipulation has also played a significant role in shaping the perception of Muslims as a threat. Far-right and nationalist political groups in the UK have often used anti-Muslim rhetoric to galvanize support, portraying Muslims as a threat to British values and identity. These groups exploit fears of immigration, terrorism, and cultural change to advance their agendas, often framing Muslims as the other, who are fundamentally incompatible with British society. This rhetoric is not confined to fringe groups. Mainstream political figures have also at times engaged in dog-whistle politics, using coded language to appeal to voters' fears and prejudices without overtly endorsing Islamophobia. This political climate creates an environment where anti-Muslim sentiment is normalized and even legitimized, making it more difficult to challenge and overcome. The social and economic challenges faced by many Muslims in the UK contribute to their marginalization and the perception of them as a separate or alien community. Muslims in the UK are more likely to experience poverty, unemployment, and educational disparities than other groups. These socio-economic factors can lead to social isolation and reinforce the perception that Muslims are not integrating into British society. However, this perception is often based on superficial observations, rather than an understanding of the underlying causes of these challenges. For example, the higher rates of unemployment among Muslims are often attributed to cultural differences or a lack of willingness to assimilate, rather than structural discrimination or economic inequality. This misunderstanding leads to further stigmatization and prejudice, creating a vicious cycle where Muslims are both marginalized and blamed for their marginalization. Cultural differences between Muslims and the broader British society can also contribute to misunderstandings and prejudices. Practices such as wearing the hijab or niqab, observing dietary restrictions, or adhering to traditional family structures can be seen as signs of refusal to integrate, or as a rejection of British values. These cultural practices are often misunderstood or misrepresented in the media, leading to stereotypes about Muslims being backward, oppressive, or intolerant. These stereotypes are reinforced by public figures who sometimes frame cultural differences as threats to social cohesion or national security, further entrenching the perception of Muslims as a threat. Prejudices and biases against Muslims, often referred to as Islamophobia, are widespread in the UK and manifest in various forms, including discrimination, hate crimes, and social exclusion. Islamophobia is rooted in ignorance, fear of the unknown, and the tendency to generalize about a diverse group based on the actions of a few. This prejudice is often expressed in subtle ways, such as in hiring practices, where Muslims may be passed over for jobs due to their name, dress, or perceived cultural differences. It can also be more overt, as seen in the rise of hate crimes against Muslims, which have increased in the wake of terrorist attacks or inflammatory political rhetoric. These acts of prejudice and discrimination not only harm individual Muslims, but also reinforce the perception of Muslims as outsiders who do not belong in British society. Stereotyping plays a significant role in shaping prejudices against Muslims. The Muslim community in the UK is incredibly diverse, encompassing a wide range of ethnicities, cultures, and religious practices. However, this diversity is often overlooked, and Muslims are frequently portrayed as a monolithic group with uniform beliefs and behaviors. This oversimplification feeds into biases and fears, as people are more likely to associate Muslims with negative stereotypes if they do not recognize the complexity and individuality within the community. For example, the stereotype of the Muslim terrorist or the oppressed Muslim woman ignores the vast majority of Muslims who do not fit these narrow and harmful images. These stereotypes are perpetuated by the media, politicians, and public discourse, making it difficult for positive or nuanced representations of Muslims to gain traction. The global context also plays a significant role in shaping perceptions of Muslims in the UK. Ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and the portrayal of these conflicts in Western media often depict Muslims as aggressors or as inherently violent. This framing of global events contributes to the perception of Muslims as a threat, as people may subconsciously associate the violence and instability they see in the news with the Muslims they encounter in their own communities. The refugee crisis, particularly from countries like Syria and Afghanistan, has also been framed in ways that stoke fears of an influx of Muslim immigrants, who are often portrayed as potential terrorists or as a burden on society. These global narratives feed into local prejudices, creating a feedback loop where international events reinforce domestic fears and biases. Despite these challenges, many Muslims in the UK are actively working to counter negative stereotypes and promote understanding and integration. Community organizations, interfaith groups, and individual Muslims are engaged in efforts to challenge Islamophobia, promote positive representations of Muslims, and build bridges between communities. These efforts often involve dialogue, education, and community engagement, as well as legal and advocacy work to combat discrimination and hate crimes. While these initiatives have had some success in raising awareness and changing perceptions, they face significant challenges in a climate where negative portrayals of Muslims are deeply ingrained and constantly reinforced by powerful forces in society. The government and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, also play a role in addressing Islamophobia and promoting integration. Various initiatives have been launched to combat discrimination, support the integration of Muslim communities, and ensure that counterterrorism efforts do not unfairly target or alienate Muslims. These initiatives often involve partnerships between government agencies, community groups, and civil society organizations, and they aim to create a more inclusive and cohesive society. However, these efforts are sometimes undermined by broader political and social dynamics that continue to perpetuate the perception of Muslims as a threat. For example, while the government may promote anti-discrimination policies, it may simultaneously implement security measures or immigration policies that disproportionately affect Muslims, sending mixed messages and complicating efforts to build trust. The perception of Muslims as a threat in the UK is a multifaceted issue that cannot be reduced to simple biases or misconceptions. It is the result of a complex interplay of historical legacies, contemporary security concerns, media representations, political agendas, and social dynamics. These factors have combined to create a climate of fear and suspicion toward Muslims, which is often based on stereotypes and prejudices rather than on a nuanced understanding of the Muslim community. Addressing these perceptions requires a multifaceted approach that includes better representation, dialogue, and understanding between communities, as well as a critical examination of the factors that contribute to fear and mistrust. Ultimately, overcoming the perception of Muslims as a threat will require a concerted effort by all segments of society. This includes challenging prejudices and stereotypes, promoting positive representations of Muslims, and addressing the social and economic inequalities that contribute to the marginalization of Muslim communities. It also requires holding the media and political figures accountable for the ways in which they portray Muslims and ensuring that policies aimed at protecting national security do not unfairly target or stigmatize Muslim communities. By working together, it is possible to create a more inclusive and cohesive society where Muslims are seen not as a threat, but as an integral part of the British community.